This image illustrates how racial and power hierarchies operated during slavery in the United States. A black woman is shown kneeling, serving as a mount for a white boy, highlighting the state of submission imposed on the enslaved. In addition to being treated as property, black men, women, and children were subjected to practices that reinforced their inferiority, including constant physical and psychological humiliation. This poster, dated November 16, 1863, was produced during the American Civil War and announces a public auction of enslaved people. It lists 3 black men and several women accompanied by their children, demonstrating how these individuals were treated as mere commodities. The text highlights payment conditions, including the possibility of credit, revealing how their dignity was completely disregarded in favor of financial transactions. This scene is from a recent film that portrays slavery from a sexual perspective. During an auction, a white woman evaluates the body of an African American man wearing only minimal clothing. The scene underscores how these individuals were viewed as disposable objects, deprived of any autonomy and subjected to humiliations that extended far beyond simple economic transactions. This image shows an African American boy chained to a wooden structure, a common form of punishment during the slavery era. The chains and yoke he carries illustrate both the physical restraint and the mental control exerted over the enslaved. Even at a young age, children were subjected to forced labor and severe punishments, growing up in an environment where violence and exploitation were part of daily life. In the image, 2 white men point their guns at a seated African American woman who has been captured in Kentucky. Her posture indicates submission, while the men adopt an authoritative and threatening stance. The scene documents an episode of slavery in the United States, demonstrating how control over people's bodies and lives was maintained through violence and intimidation. The image depicts African American prisoners subjected to punishment, tied up and positioned over a log. A guard holds a whip, standing nearby, ready to administer the punishment. This scene recalls practices that persisted from the slavery period through the Reconstruction era, when corporal punishment was used to enforce order in forced labor prison camps. In the image, an African American man is tied to a post in what appears to be a prison setting. He awaits the application of physical punishment while a group of white men observes the scene. This scenario recalls the corporal punishment practices that continued in prisons even after the abolition of slavery. This scene portrays an African man sitting with his body hunched and his eyes lowered. In front of him are the severed limbs of his young daughter, a result of a punishment inflicted upon him. This practice was part of the coercive system during colonial exploitation in the Congo, when, under the rule of King Leopold II of Belgium, colonizers imposed strict rubber production quotas, resorting to brutal punishments to enforce compliance. In the image, a white woman is seated in a litter while 2 African American men carry her. The scene highlights the social structure of the time, in which the division of labor and roles was defined by power relations based on race and class. The men, assigned to perform intense physical labor, carried the litter, while the woman occupied a position that removed her from manual work. The image captures a 19th century everyday scene, where heavy labor was systematically assigned to enslaved people, with no regard for their humanity. In the foreground, a group of women, some white and others African American, share the same space in the photograph. It is likely that the African American women were either enslaved or domestic workers, common roles for black individuals at the time. In this image, an African American woman is seen performing personal care tasks for a young white girl. The scene evokes historical contexts from the American South, where during slavery, many black women were responsible for domestic duties on plantations or in the households of wealthy families. In this photograph, a group of African men is gathered while being closely watched by Europeans. One of them holds what appears to be another person's hand, evidence of the punishments inflicted in that context. The image was taken in the Congo under the rule of Leopold II, when rubber extraction became the main economic activity imposed by the colonial administration. In 1838, a poster offered $150 for the capture of Henry May, a black man who had escaped from his owner. The text listed details about his height, skin tone, and any visible marks, as well as emphasizing his experience in domestic work, which justified the high reward. The message also speculated that Henry might be heading toward a free state, highlighting the risks faced by those who tried to escape and the boldness of each step taken in search of freedom. This image shows a tobacco plantation in Delhi, Sumatra, during the period when the region was under Dutch colonial rule. The Delhi Maatschapppij established these plantations in the 19th century, employing workers brought in from various parts of Southeast Asia, primarily Chinese and Javanese immigrants, who were recruited under contracts promising good conditions, promises that were rarely kept in practice. These laborers, known as coolies, worked long hours under constant surveillance and risked physical punishment for any infraction. In many cases, they lived in poorly built barracks and received only basic food rations. European supervisors managed the administration, reinforcing the social divide between those who produced the wealth and those who controlled it. Photographer Carl Joseph Kleingroth documented scenes that exposed this disparity. His images captured the fields, the coolies' living quarters, and the presence of armed overseers, exposing the power dynamics that kept the system running. This image shows an African-American man with extensive scars on his back, the result of physical punishment endured during slavery in the United States. These marks, likely caused by countless whippings, reveal how violence was used to instill fear and enforce submission. In labor camps, the whip was a tool of control, reinforcing the notion that enslaved people had no rights over their own bodies. The scene takes place in a vast cotton field stretching as far as the eye can see. Under the scorching sun, men, women, and children move slowly between the rows of plants, picking the white fibers with their calloused hands. Their clothing is simple and shows signs of wear from the long hours of labor. Further in the background, overseers monitor every step, creating an atmosphere of constant tension. When someone fails to meet the required quota, shouts and threats break the silence, reinforcing the fear of immediate punishment. The work continues without pause from dawn until nightfall, under conditions marked by both physical and psychological exhaustion. This image captures a typical moment from the colonial period, where a white man is seated in a litter or palanquin, carried by two black men or local workers. While the passenger remains in a comfortable position, his carriers display the physical effort required for the task, making the power and status difference clear. This method of transportation, accessible only to those with wealth, highlights the class division and racial inequality of the time, showing how the luxury of a few depended on the hard labor of many.